Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an A07 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. When I was a kid, the only beer I was familiar with were those that came in red and white colored cans or brown bottles, and they always contained a simple, crisp, pale lager. It wasn't until I was in college that I learned that there were actually other styles of beer that offered drinkers a wider variety of flavors. I turned 21 in 2002 and ended up spending a ton of time at my local brewery at the time, which was Boundary Bay in Bellingham, Washington, who always had an IPA on tap. Now, that was a long time ago, but I recall that specific beer being quite bitter with a decent malt character, and while I'm sure there was some light fruity hop notes, that is not what stood out to me at the time. It's not how I remember that beer. Well, since then, things have changed. Oh boy, have they changed a lot when it comes to IPA. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to share our opinions on the evolution of the IPA is contributor Jordan Folks.
At this point, I think IPA represents something like 50% of craft sales.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how many sub-styles exist within this broader kind of theme. Even within the BJCP, they mark several options in terms of IPA sub-styles. But in reality, there's probably a plethora of more. And boy, have they changed along the way. So I thought, why don't we actually unpack that? And what is this beverage that we call IPA? What are the different forms in which it takes? And, maybe leave in a little friendly debate. Is X really different than Y, or what do we think about the various approaches? I think there's a lot to unpack there.
Absolutely. I mean, if ever they were a controversial beer style, I would have to say IPA is it, particularly with the rise of these certain sub-styles that you pointed out. It's sort of wild for me to think about how quickly my obsession with beer happened. I mean, I was buying all sorts of craft options in the months following my 21st birthday. And then within that year, I was making my own, and IPA was definitely on my short list of favorites, which is crazy because the IPA I was making back then is nothing at all like the various types of IPA common these days. I am really looking forward to chatting with you about our opinions on this and, like you said, engaging in some friendly debate. Now, just a reminder, we say this every time we do a Brews Use episode, that we are going to allow ourselves to speak a little bit more freely than usual, so just a little heads up. We might use language that some people don't like. We might share opinions that you disagree with. It's all in good fun, we promise. All we ask is that you remember it is not our point to offend you or anyone else, but just have an honest conversation in a less filtered manner. Alrighty, if you enjoy this show and you want us to help continue producing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, which you can do over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. The guest for November of 2024 is assistant professor in food chemistry at the University of Arkansas, Dr. Scott LaFontaine. If you've been listening to the Brew Lab podcast, this name is likely familiar to you, as Dr. LaFontaine has been interviewed a few times, touching on topics like brewing with rice and how on-vine maturity affects cascade hop aroma. Suffice to say, Scott is a trove of brewing knowledge, and we're very excited that our patrons have the opportunity to pick his brain. He's going to be hanging out with patrons on Saturday, November 23rd, 2024. So all you have to do is make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday the 22nd. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support and become a patron today over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found online at brewlosophy.com/support. When shopping online, your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral that helps us cover the costs of running all of this stuff. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allow you to leave those ratings and reviews, that would be awesome too. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use, with a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed in one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an amazing YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear or even just reasonably priced kettles and such, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer over at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Charlie Johnson from the UK wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 351, where we focused on water chemistry. Charlie said, "You noted that the amount of salts you add to your brewing water is mostly dictated by your desired sulfate and chloride levels, and the amount of calcium that's added by way of gypsum and calcium chloride is essentially just along for the ride. Interestingly, a new craft brewery here in the UK is producing some of the best hazy IPA I've had, and it's no secret they're adding high amounts of potassium chloride to their water, as well as calcium and sodium chloride. I think the reason for this is they want to bump up the chloride level to the extreme to accentuate that perceived fullness and smooth mouthfeel, but do not want to go crazy with the calcium and sodium levels by adding tons of calcium chloride and table salt. As you noted, exceeding the upper limits for calcium and sodium can lead to undesirable effects, including impaired fermentation and salty off flavors. So I can understand why this brewery is choosing to add the extra chloride boost from the potassium salt. But why is no one else talking about potassium salts in brewing? I noted there's not even an option to adjust potassium levels in the water profile tool on Brewfather. From what I've picked up from the quote nerdy bits displayed on this brewery's cans, the levels of potassium can exceed 100 ppm, and I haven't noticed any off flavors, but I suppose there could be other undesirable effects like yeast health and health hazards to consider. Have you guys had any experience with potassium salts or heard of any brewers in the US using them? Maybe there's a reason potassium salts aren't generally used in brewing. Is this something that you're familiar with, Jordan?
I know potassium is a thing, but I really don't know about its contribution to brewing profiles or whatever. We got to get Martin Brungard on one of our shows. Maybe he could do a Q&A with our Patreons, because he is a really big wealth of knowledge on this topic, and I guarantee you he would have an opinion.
Yeah, I actually feel I'm pretty sure Martin has been on our Brew&A or our Patreon Q&A before. I almost wonder if we can't convince Cade to get him on the Brew Lab to talk about water stuff, because this is a really interesting topic. The only time I've ever heard of brewers adding potassium to beer is in the form of KMB, or potassium metabisulfite, which are Campton tablets, but that's usually, I don't know of anybody using it for flavoring. They're typically using it to knock chlorine or chloramine out of the water prior to brewing, or more commonly recently is to reduce the risk of cold side oxidation at packaging, because that metabisulfite scrubs oxygen from the beer. So, in both of those instances, minuscule amounts are used. So I don't believe it's having any flavorful impact on any meaningful impact on the flavor of the beer, at least that isn't better explained by the reduction of oxygen or chlorine, right? So I personally, I've never used potassium chloride. I've never purchased or even had it in my presence. So I'm not aware if it has any impact. I don't know any friends. I asked my local brewing crew if they've ever used potassium chloride. All of them said no. So the fact that you've had this positive experience with the hazy IPA made by your local brewery there, I think is really cool and certainly piques my interest. Maybe we can come up with some sort of a comparative experiment, right? With like potassium chloride and calcium chloride to see if there is a noticeable difference when either is used as the sole source of chloride. I don't know. You would think that the calcium versus the potassium might actually, to me at least, Jordan, might actually contribute some sort of a perceptible difference.
Yeah, well, you'll see Martin comment on homebrew forums, at least from back in the day, about his advice on calcium levels specifically, and then mentioning in separate sentences what he thinks about the sulfate to chloride ratio. So, and he'll mention things not specifically about like fermentation quality, but like that's too much calcium, and so there's got to be something going on there.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that, again, something for future, chewing on by the crew to see if we can experiment with it. Thank you so much for the email, Charlie. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show. You do not need to put an umlaut in there. If you're listening to this podcast, we are confident you're going to love the videos Martin's creating over at YouTube as well. When we return from this break, our views on the evolution of IPA. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Got great ideas, but no idea how to build a website? Get Bluehost. Their AI design tool creates high-quality WordPress sites super fast. Whether you're a blogger, influencer, or launching a side hustle, Bluehost helps boost your growth with built-in marketing and e-commerce tools. Upgrade to cloud and get 100% uptime and 24/7 security to stay online all the time. Why wait? You've got the vision. Make it real. Visit Bluehost.com to get started.
Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Now is the time to make a plan. Whether you plan to vote absentee by mail, in person at your county auditor's office before Election Day, or at your polling place on November 5th, it's important you take steps now to make your plan at voterready.iowa.gov. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Find more info at voterready.iowa.gov. This message is presented by the Iowa Secretary of State.
When I started drinking craft beer, which was right around the time I started brewing, IPA, at least the stuff I could get up in the Pacific Northwest, was notably bitter with a fairly strong hop or malt presence. And while it was clearly more hoppy than, say, a Miller Lite or whatever, it was nowhere near the fruit bombs that we're drinking today. I think I talked in a recent episode about the first all-grain beer I ever made. It was an IPA recipe that I had designed based on what was available at my local homebrew shop at the time, their recipes and such. This was back in 2003, and the vast majority of the hops were added at the start of the boil, with smaller amounts added at 30 and 15 minutes. There was no whirlpool additions. I'm sure there was a modest dry hop addition, but nothing like, that initial 60-minute addition to get as much bitterness in this beer as possible. Such a beer today would probably get me laughed right out of the homebrew club meeting, which to me is a sure sign of just how much this popular style has evolved over the years.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I don't know if you've seen the AHA Learn to Brew recipe for this year, but I was really left scratching my head. It's a IPA recipe with 0 dry hop and like 70 IBUs from 3 additions between first wort and 60 minutes, and only 2 ounces in the whirlpool. I'm like, this is an IPA? And we and my friends were joking about it, and he said, yeah, that'd be a great IPA 50 years ago.
Dude, I'm telling you, not even 50 years ago, 20 years ago. That was, do you remember, when did you start brewing, Jordan?
About 12 years ago.
Okay, so I started brewing about 10 years prior to that. Okay, so just in that decade, the shift that I was able to witness as somebody who was drinking these beers, brewing these beers, was crazy. It was huge. It was, and part of what inspired this episode was the fact that a lot of us were sitting back saying, why are we calling this IPA? It's become its own thing, right? This thing has changed so much that it's barely even like a whisper of what it used to be. And the truth is, though, IPA has a very long history. Now, this is Brew's Views, so we really do want to focus on our opinions. But I feel like it's only prudent to go over a little bit of the history of the IPA, because of the fact that there is some controversy when it comes to the stories that we've all heard about how this style came to be.
Right. So the story that everyone's heard is that IPA, which really doesn't stand for anything anymore, but it's indicative of what it used to stand for, which was India Pale Ale, was a British beer that was sent to India, perhaps to be enjoyed by the troops that they were colonizing there. And it was a uniquer beer. And the legend has it that they were getting spoiled beer in the colony. And so they started adding hops to the casks that were getting sent across the sea. And they found that it had this like preservative effect. And so there's so much like lore that's built up into this story that I've heard the wackiest things. My friend back in grad school when I was learning to homebrew, he regaled me of the story that he had a friend that homebrewed from where he was from in Kentucky that recreated the original IPA to the extent that he made this device that shook the barrel for 6 months.
Wow.
In his basement to recreate the voyage across the Indian Ocean.
Oh my God.
And it was allegedly the best beer he's ever tried.
Bullshit. I call bullshit.
I know, right? But when we look at the actual history, there is some truth to that in the sense of they were dry hopping these beers and they were shipping them to India. However, Mitch Steele's research on the subject suggested that it was more of a serendipitous event. It wasn't as necessarily intentional. And there's no proof that I think it's Hodgson,
yeah.
That was the original purveyor of India Pale Ale. There's no proof that they invented this method either.
Right.
It's just that they were shipping these dry hop beers over there. They survived, presumably because the hops, fight lacto infections, etc., and they were enjoyed. And so it's more of just a happy accident to a certain extent. But nonetheless, there is real history behind the shipping of this pale ale to India and it being dry hopped, which was somewhat novel at the time. And it really, who would have thought that it would have launched an entire craft beer revolution hundreds of years ago?
Well, yeah, I think about what, obviously we can only project, but I think about what must have been going through the minds of brewers and drinkers back in the day, back when these styles weren't even really, identified or defined styles. All the talk about early like English beers was about malt. It was about malt and fermentation. And, as you read the history of fermentation and English beer in particular, it's discovering that you can isolate, these yeast and then get rid of the stuff that spoils the beer, quote unquote, of course. The focus really is on that stuff. And then somehow it became hops. Like that is the primary, to the point that nowadays, and we'll get into this later as well, the last thing a lot of IPA brewers want in their beer is anything reminiscent of malt. They just want to get that out of the way. That's there to because it's only beer with it. But you want all of this hop character without that. And that to me is one of the biggest changes that we've seen. And that change has happened over a century or more, but also just in the last 15 to 20 years.
Oh my gosh, we have gotten so much leaner. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but crystal malt is like a big no-no nowadays. But that was a core part of the recipe just even 10 years ago. But let's go back a little bit in time. So the origin of IPA is kind of around the founding of America. I think that I heard that they started branding it as such in like the 1820s or so. But they had been making it for 50 years prior. And so then fast forward to the late 1800s, and we start to see IPA brewed here in America by the Ballantine Brewing Company out of Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to think about is that you had these people who you knew had in some way, probably familially, ties to the old world, right? This is the late 19th century. They're making beers that were likely inspired by their English counterparts or grandfathers or whoever it may have been. And this Ballantine Brewing Company says, you know what, let's try. Let's just go with this more hop forward style of beer. I never found a recipe for Ballantine Brewing Company's beer, but I've read about, I guess I found some kind of replicas of it online, but I read about people who have made their versions of that recipe. And these were malt bombs. They had more hops in them. They weren't super strong. They weren't like 9%, imperial IPAs, but they had a lot of malt, and it wasn't just Pilsner or pale malt.
Yeah, and so this thing was brewed for like 100 years, from like 1890 to the 1990s. I think finally the final brews of it were actually brewed by Pabst. But the early descriptions of it described that it was using traditional methods like dry hopping and aging in oak for up to a year, as well as distilling extract from whole bullion hops that were used in the conditioning. So I think that at the very least we know it was a hoppy beer, and I would imagine that whatever was brewed in 1890 was probably a little different than what the final brew in the 1990s would have been.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I don't doubt that at all. So from that point forward, though, I think, no one was going to argue that the early 20th century is when there was like a craft beer boom. Back then, it was just beer. And you had these different breweries who were starting businesses, no doubt trying to, make a living for themselves and their family. But over the following, we'll say 80 to 90 years, you had these other breweries popping up throughout the nation of the United States. And some of them were throwing their hat in the IPA ring, as it were, and coming up with their own versions of hoppier or hop forward, what we would call IPA, I suppose. I mean, this is kind of where we get into kind of muddy waters, is were they even IPA? I don't know if they were calling them that back then. One that comes to my mind, though, is Liberty Ale from Anchor Brewing, which we know. I mean, there's kind of an interesting story that you just filled me in on with Liberty Ale, Jordan. But Liberty Ale was a pretty early version of a hoppy, India Pale Ale, if I recall.
Yeah, so when you look on the internet, you'll see that Anchor's Liberty Ale was debuted in 1975, and that's true. But if you dig a little deeper, you learn that it actually was a different type of beer in 75. It was described as opaque coffee brown, intense malty aroma, huge body, big malt flavor all the way through to the lingering roast malt aftertaste. So the Beervana blog says, well, it sounds more like a porter to me. And it wasn't until like 83 or 82 or so that they rebrewed it to a different kind of format, but retained the Liberty Ale name. And that in the early 80s was kind of their debut of a kind of, at the time, modern American IPA, which notably featured dry hops. And so in my opinion, that's really a defining characteristic of an IPA, is being dry hopped. Really, in the totality of styles that are out there, there aren't many that are dry hopped that aren't an IPA, or some sort of form of IPA, right? And so around that same time, we also have the launch of Sierra Nevada in 1980. And so they're releasing this Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which is featuring the Cascade hop. And so it's really in like the turn of the 1980s decade is when we start to see IPA brewing happening in California, which although Ballantine goes back even farther, in my opinion, this really sets the stage for the modern hoppy beer movement.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I feel like they were standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say. Ken Grossman with Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, Fritz Maytag and his crew with Anchor, and really I think looking for something unique and new, because these are businesses, and that's what you have to do with business. Also, lovers of beer and wanting to push this thing forward. I would reckon that if you were to if you could go back to the year I was born, 1981, and I could be 25 there in that year, and you served me a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, assuming that it's basically the same recipe that we have access to today, and you told me it was an IPA, I would have no doubts that was an IPA. They happened to call it a pale ale at a time when IPA was kind of defining itself, coming into its own. And so I think that's probably why. But you've got a 5.6% beer that's hoppy as hell. It also has a nice malt backbone to it. That was the way IPA was brewed back then. So even though it's called pale ale and doesn't qualify as an IPA in these days by any means, to me, I can see how the reason I wanted to talk about Sierra Nevada in this section is because of the fact that I genuinely believe their focus on hops really is what I think served to push the style forward. Now, since this is Brews Views, I have a couple questions for you here. Jordan, have you ever tried Anchor Brewing Liberty Ale?
I probably have. I did the Anchor tour once, and it was incredible. I would have had to have tried it there. I just haven't had enough to remember what it tastes like nowadays.
So I've had a lot of Liberty Ale because they used to include it in their mix packs. And so it'd be, you get their or their steam beer, some porter, and Liberty Ale. And I was never a fan of that beer. And it was hoppy, but it was hoppy in a very in my mind, a unique way. It wasn't those big fruity hops that I'm used to. I think it came across to me as a little bit more piney and earthy, but awesome. It was good beer. Don't get me wrong. It just didn't really tickle that IPA itch for me. Mind you, I'm drinking this in the 2000s, so I already have my ideas of what an IPA is. But I want to know your opinions on Green Label as well, on Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. To this day, if I see Sierra Nevada Pale Ale on tap, I'll ask for a sample of it. And if it tastes fresh, that's what I'm ordering the entire time. I love it so much.
Right. Well, I think it's a fantastic beer. It doesn't age well with the use of crystal malt, but if it's fresh, it's so good.
Yeah.
But I think that what's really a defining characteristic of both the Anchor and the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is the use of Cascade hops. So
that's right.
If you're looking back at the original IPA, were they using Fuggle or something like that probably? And those wouldn't have been particularly fruity or citrusy. And then the Ballantine IPA, we just learned that they were using Bouillon hops. I don't know how particularly fruity those were, but I'm guessing not that much. So I think we're kind of, the earlier examples were kind of just bitter and earthy probably, right? But then in the early 80s, they discovered this beautiful hop that was, I think, developed here in Oregon. And the rumor that I've heard was that the big brewers like AB InBev or Budweiser at the time passed over it because they had too much flavor. And because they wanted all the alpha they could get and they didn't want any flavor to get in the way. And so Ken Grossman and others were like, dude, this tastes awesome. And all, dry hopping methods, et cetera, aside, I think that this really opens the floodgates for what hops can really bring to a beer.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, Ken Grossman's an amazing dude. I don't want to kiss his ass too much here. I credit him with starting the move or start opening our minds to the idea of moving those hop additions from early in the kettle later and later and later into the process. Because if you look at something like Celebration Ale, which we are so fortunate that should be coming out soon if it hasn't already. But Celebration Ale came out originally in 1981, and many view this as being kind of a quintessential American IPA, a style-defining beer that is still popular to this day. You drink one of those, especially when it's fresh, they just delivered it to the store, and you pour that can or that bottle into a glass. It is so hoppy, while also being, you probably know what color it is, Jordan, right? It's like a red beer. It's so good, though.
Yeah, that was another beer that does not age that well, in my opinion. When it's fresh, it's really fantastic, but when it gets old, it's just off, in my opinion. But I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it because there was one year for Christmas when I was visiting my parents that live in Oklahoma City. So, I live in Portland, and I was visiting them with my girlfriend at the time. And one night we drank like an entire 6-pack. And so I don't remember how many of those I had, but maybe 4 of them or something. And I do not puke often. It's been
no.
That might have been the last time in my life that I puked, and I puked my guts out from celebrating a little too hard the night before, and it really kind of soured my palate on that beer. So it's like once you have a bad experience with something like that, I know it's not their fault, but I drank way too many old Celebrations one night, and I just can't go back.
I love it. So the only beer that I have an issue with like that, thankfully, is Mickey's, because when I was in college, my roommate brought me a Mickey's 40, and I chugged it in like 3 minutes and spent the night puking it all out. It was awful. But that is not the case with me for Celebration Ale, thankfully, because I love that beer. I like the fact that it's seasonal as well, because it gives me something to look forward to. So kudos to Sierra Nevada and Ken Grossman, because I really do feel like they're the ones who initiated this. They're the ones who stoked the flames, as I'll put it, because IPA had been around for 100 years prior to that, of course. Now, in the 90s, I don't know, late 80s to mid to late 90s, I think, we experienced what a lot of people nowadays refer to as the IBU wars. Of course, IBU referring to the International Bittering Unit, which is a controversial topic in and of itself. But basically, what it seemed people were doing, or breweries were doing, was making IPA to be as bitter as possible, almost as like a badge of, look what I can deal with. That was my experience, at least. Now, I don't know when you started drinking beer, like craft beer, Jordan, but for me, it was right around 2002 when I turned 21. And I'll tell you, the IPA that I had available to me at the time, living up in Bellingham, Washington, they were bitter. I mean, there is no denying the bitterness of the beers that we had up there.
Right. So I turned 21 in like 2009 or something like that. And I was living in Oklahoma City, and they had they just revised their beer laws like a couple years ago. So up until a couple years ago, strong beer had to be sold in a liquor store, and it had to be sold warm, and it couldn't be sold it couldn't be stored cold, and it couldn't be sold on Sundays. And so what that meant is that very few craft breweries were willing to ship beer to Oklahoma because they knew it would sit on a shelf and rapidly stale. We did an experiment recently testing this theory, and you do not want to hold your hoppy beers warm. No. And also, we didn't really have any craft breweries in the state at the time. There were just a couple examples. They weren't making IPA. So there were 2 IPAs that I could get when I was 21 from the liquor store, and it was Big Sky IPA out of Montana and Flying Dog IPA out of Maryland. And both were fairly malty and probably horribly oxidized in age by the time I was drinking them. Right. And so they weren't like the crazy IBU wars. It was kind of like this more old school Midwest, East Coast malt bomb IPAs. It wasn't until I moved to Portland in 2010 where I really was fighting on the front lines of the IBU wars. What was that one from Green Flash called again?
Oh, God. I think they called it West Coast, or was it Palette? It was like Palette Blaster or something like that, right?
Something like that. Yeah, it really was. Yeah. And so they were trying to make these aggressively bitter beers, and living on the West Coast for the first time, I really was able to access them. And so the California ones I thought were really pushing the envelope, but same here in the Northwest, like Ninkasi's Tricera hops was extremely bitter. What was the one from Lagunitas that came in the bomber? Do you remember that one?
So when I think of Lagunitas, I think of Lagunitas IPA, which to me was one of the beers that started the move towards or away from bitterness and towards hop character. The ones that come to my mind when I think of like hyper bitter, I'll never forget. We were my wife and I. Well, she was my girlfriend at the time. We were both 21 and going to school at Western Washington University. Go Death Cab for Cutie. And we were going to drive down to her parents' place to have dinner one weekend. And my father-in-law says, "Hey, grab a 6-pack of beer. I want to try some of the." I'd started brewing already, all this stuff, and he says, "Grab a 6-pack. I want to try some of this crazy stuff that you're drinking." So I grabbed Red Hook Longhammer. Have you ever had this stuff?
It's been a long time.
Oh my God, it's bitter. It's so bitter. I served this, at the time, 50-year-old dude, a beer that he'd never come close to. He's a Coors Light drinker. His face when he took that first sip, I couldn't even finish the 6-pack is how bitter it was. But the thing is, that was the way it was done back then. And then, like you said, right around like the early 90s, we started to see this move away from bitter and into hop aroma and hop flavor. And boy, has that shifted where our perspectives of IPA lie. I would say that was in part because of the fact that it was West Coast brewers doing this. That was really the move into what we refer to nowadays as West Coast IPA.
Right. I mean, because back in the day, they were bragging about how many IBUs were in their beers, right? And it was Hop Stupid by Lagunitas. Remember that bomber?
Yep, I sure do.
And the label says 102 IBU for you, right? And so everyone was bragging about how they're getting 100 IBUs or like, it's a number so high we can't even tell you. And it's just really laughable to think back about those brands and the attitude at the time. But I gotta say, I really credit the change that we've seen to the hazy IPA brewers. They took a completely opposite perspective. Instead of 100 IBUs, how about we do like 10? And instead of it being, super bitter, how about it's like not bitter at all? And instead of like dry and spritzy, it's like soft and pillowy and hazy and not clear, right? And it just totally flipped everything on its head. And I think that coming back a few years later, we're like, well, maybe we can take the best of both worlds and actually make beers that are drinkable more so than either counterpart.
So this might be our first friendly disagreement here. My perspective was that you had a bunch of these West Coast brewers who are realizing, and we'll go over some of them and share our opinions on these breweries as well, but they're realizing, hey, These beers don't have to be enamel peelers, as Jamil Zainasheff used to commonly refer to them. They don't have to be so harsh in the bitterness. But if we take the same amount of hops and we move them into later in the process, which to me is a natural thought when you're thinking of what the classic perspective of kettle hopping was, right? Early in the kettle was for bittering, middle of the boil is for flavor, and then end of the boil was for aroma. We know that that's not necessarily true nowadays, but aspects of it are. I could see, brewers like Vinny Cilurzo or Greg Cook and these people from these big notable IPA breweries, I could see them saying, well, let's just try pushing those later, reduce that bitterness, but let's see what happens if we increase this hop character. And then you had the hazy IPA people saying, well, let's just take that to its extreme. What happens if we don't throw any hops into the boil and we just hit it in the whirlpool with a ton of hops? Can we extract a bunch of that fruitiness while maintaining this kind of fluffy, soft, pillowy character in the beer? And it worked. Obviously they had to do some tweaks and figure things out, but they've got it down pat now. So to me, it's because of the West Coast IPA movement that hazy IPA brewers were like, okay, we've got something now that's the next stepping stone. I don't feel like it was the hazy IPA brewers first and then West Coast IPA brewers came after that.
Right. I don't know for a fact, but I do think that the modern 2024 state of West Coast IPA is based on some lessons that we learned from the East Coast. Whether allegedly the Alchemist Heady Topper was the first kind of New England IPA.
Yeah.
And even then, when you drink one of those, it's not nearly the same thing as like a Treehouse or a Trillium. But it would be interesting to hear from him. Is his name? What's the guy's name again?
John Kimmich.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to hear his reactions. Like, how much was this beer based on what he was learning from West Coast breweries?
Yeah.
I don't really know that perspective, but nonetheless, that came out in 2003. But, there was a lot of stuff that happened before him on the West Coast, like Lagunitas 93, Blind Pig 94, Stone 96, and then Russian River transitioning out of Blind Pig in 97. And even then, though, Russian River's IPAs are kind of more old school than new school.
Yep.
What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. And I'll say this, that their well-known IPA and double IPA, obviously, Pliny the Elder. If you have Vinny's Blind Pig IPA, which he developed when he was at Blind Pig Brewing in Temecula, California, where I believe his parents have a winery there or something like that, before he moved up to Santa Rosa and started Russian River a few years later. If you have a Blind Pig, to me, it's kind of a classic original version of a West Coast IPA. It is definitely hoppy in terms of the fruity characteristics, but it's got a nice assertive bitterness and there's some malt backbone to it. If you go and you grab, what do they call it? They make one now called Hophead or something like that. I forget.
Happy Hops?
Happy Hops, yeah. That to me is a classic West Coast IPA. It's very, very pale. There's very little malt character to it, but it is just hop to high heaven, and I love it. Is it Pliny the Elder? Absolutely not. Again, Pliny, a double IPA, arguably, that is going to be a bit more malty. It's going to have a little bit more of that classic character. But one thing I feel like Vinny specifically did is he put on the big stage that you can get away with hoppy beers without them being excessively bitter.
Right. And also he taught us that we can add sugar to our IPAs as well.
To dry them out, right? Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
Right.
So when did you first have, do you have any opinions on Lagunitas, Stone, Russian River Brewing, anything like? I feel like those guys deserve a ton of credit for where we're at today with IPA.
Well, I don't really like Lagunitas IPA in the modern era, but man, in 2010, I was blowing all of my little bit of grad school income on Hop Stupid, and they were such an incredible pioneer of hoppy beers in circa 2010. Absolutely loved them. Unfortunately, they're a big beer brand at this point. I don't know who owns them anymore, but just the scale itself is massive. And you just struggle to get the incredibly hop saturated beers at these massive scales. So I think that they're like a reliable, concert or airport beer or something like that. Meanwhile, Stone, dude, they still rock. And you don't see it as much in the Pacific Northwest anymore. I think there's just too much competition out here. But man, in 2010, Arrogant Bastard and all that stuff. I mean, that was really a man's craft beer. They put some hair on your chest.
That's right. That Arrogant Bastard was notably, well, we'll just say arrogant. The idea behind that one was to make it everything, IPA is not supposed to be and all of that. And it was very successful.
Disgusting.
Yeah, not a big fan. I'm with you. Somebody, I think it was Tasty McDole, RIP, that he described it as like, maybe it wasn't him because I think he was a big fan of it. Somebody described it as like pennies in your mouth. There's like a metallic thing to it. Yeah, I wasn't a big fan. I will say though, I had a buddy, we had some people over a few weeks ago and, as it happens, people bring beer over to share. And a buddy of mine brought over a 6-pack of Little Something Something, Lagunitas Little Something Something. And I'm telling you, thankfully it was less than a month old from packaging. And it tasted exactly how I remember it from 10 years ago, which is, in my opinion, phenomenal. I feel like that is such an excellent beer in every way. From it to me, it has a lot of those characteristics in terms of mouthfeel that you get from a hazy IPA, except it's clear, it's hoppy, and there's a crispness to it. I absolutely love it. So when was the first time you had Heady Topper? Because I'm assuming you have had Heady Topper.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story. So I was on an early work trip in my, new into my career, and I went to a training in San Francisco. And it was my first time in San Francisco as like a little bit of an older, young adult. I had been in like college and stuff. And so I had to hit up the must hits. At this point, it would have been like 2013 or so. And I walked like all the way across the city to what's the old school craft brewery there, 21st Amendment.
Oh yeah.
And like a Beyonce concert or something was getting out of the stadium nearby, and there was like thousands of people in the street, and so they didn't want all those concert goers to flood their bar before they closed, so that even though they were still open, they wouldn't let anyone else in. I was like, oh my God, man, I literally walked an hour. I'm a huge craft beer fan. I'm a home brewer from Portland, Oregon. And they're like, oh, why didn't you say so? And they opened the door and let me in and wouldn't let me pay and let me drink for free.
Oh, dude.
It was such a cool experience. And I've had so many experiences like that in this country where if you express that you're a home brewer, they really want to take care of you. And so the other one I had to hit, can you guess?
I'm thinking Anchor, but
it's at Haight Ashbury.
Oh, did you? What's it called? Oh my God, I love it. They're a restaurant too, right?
Toronado.
Toronado. Yeah, that's excellent. Magnolia was what I was thinking, though.
Also awesome. Yes,
love Magnolia. Awesome. Yeah.
So I went to Toronado, and what an incredible early craft beer experience.
Yeah.
And cash only in that giant cash register, and they had all these incredible beers, and that was probably the first time I ever got to try Pliny the Elder, because that was has always been reliably served there. And nowadays, I think in 2024, it's a little easier to find Pliny the Elder throughout the country. I mean, not like every Walmart in Arkansas has it, but it's not impossible at the very least on the West Coast. You can get Pliny the Elder all day, every day in Portland, Oregon at this point. But so I'm sitting there at the bar and trying Pliny the Elder for the first time and getting blown away. And this guy next to me is also a solo business traveler, and he's from Connecticut. And he starts talking me up. And when he finds out I'm from Portland, Oregon, he's like, "Oh my God, you have got to do me a huge favor. If you can send me a 6-pack of Deschutes Black Butte Porter, I will send you a case of Heady Topper."
That is, you're like, hell yeah, buddy.
I was like, wait, the porter that's at every gas station in the state of Oregon?
All the way down to California even, yeah.
Right. And so, this is 2013, and I had heard of the legend of Heady Topper, but I hadn't been to Vermont yet, and had never had it. And, it just, now you can even get Heady Topper in like grocery stores in Portland. And so, I sent him a 6-pack of Black Butte Porter, and he sent me like a case of Heady Topper and maybe Folkelbanger, maybe not. And I shared it with my beer nerd friends, and we were blown away. It was like the best beer I'd ever had in my life at that point. I'd never had a hazy IPA. I'd never heard of it. I just heard of the legend and the lore, and it was just so hoppy and so balanced and so incredibly good. I have been lucky enough to visit. I was actually there opening day for their new facility in 2016, and it was so new, Google Maps didn't even have it yet, and I drove to the wrong part of the state. When I showed up to an empty parking lot, I was like, what's going on? And this guy's like, yeah, we moved. Today's opening day. It's like an hour away north, and I had just come from the north. So he gave me a 6-pack as an apology. And so I went up to the Alchemist, the new location, and there was a line, like a mile-long line of humans, and it's just so crazy out there. And so I was like, what if I just want to try the beers? So they let me skip the line since I didn't get, a truckload of to go. And I got to try those beers fresh from the source, and they were so incredibly good. Flash forward to now, I hate those beers. I do not know if my palate has changed or it doesn't taste like it used to. But man, those first few times of trying it was so glorious. But nowadays, I am repulsed by what the Alchemist is putting out. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. And I think John would be fine with that as well. But and by the way, speaking of John Kimmich, we've had him as a guest on our Patreon Q&A. These are the types of folks that we're able to get to answer these Q&As. And there were some great questions asked. So if you are a patron at the $3 level or higher, go and check out that past Q&A. Lots of great information. I think it was from 3 or 4 years ago. My first time trying Heady Topper was, I believe it was 2011. My brother lives out in Buffalo, New York, and a buddy of his was big craft beer nerd, had waited in that line and picked up a whole bunch of Heady Toppers. So my brother and it was like 3 weeks old by the time it got to me, packaged one of them up, sent it out to me here in California. It was in the middle of December, so it was nice and cold. It probably didn't get warm up too much on the 2-day trip out to California from New York. And I was like you. I remembered pouring it out and thinking, God, it's ugly as hell. But my goodness, is it hoppy? It was so fruity. Last time I had one was about 6 months ago, and not a fan. It was a fresh can of it. And like you, I do think there's something about the evolution of our palates as well. It may also, I'll fully admit, it may just be bias. But I wasn't a huge fan of it. Now, I had a Lawson Sip of Sunshine about a week ago. Old Whiskey Will, our friend, sent me a bunch of East Coast beers again. And that beer is so good. First off, it's not hazy. The first time I had a Lawson's, it was kind of hazy. This one was crystal clear and absolutely delicious. So, and to my palate, different than a lot of the beers that we're able to get out here on the West Coast. So, just so many different things. Now, obviously, there are several East Coast or New England breweries who ended up adopting a lot of these practices that the Alchemist was employing, and then kind of honing their own approaches, like you said, Trillium and Treehouse and these bigger hazy IPA breweries, to produce beers that were just wildly different than what we were used to out here on the West Coast. They were hazy. They had really low bitterness. They had these extremely fruity hop aromatics and flavors, and the mouthfeel, I think most notably, in terms of the differences, was really pillowy and soft. And that was what kind of drove me away from them. Is my preference is for a crisp, washes off your palate quickly, a cooling or refreshing experience when I drink an IPA. And the opposite of that with this high hop character was just kind of a schism in my, palate experience.
Yeah. When I first tried Treehouse and Trillium, I was blown away. It was life-changing. I was like, this is the best beer I've ever had in my life. It was so hop, tropical, explosive. I wasn't even necessarily like thinking too hard about how like the lack of bitterness or the lack of clarity. Just the hop pungency and how tropical and fruity it was so amazing. And so I made some friends that lived out there and would get it shipped to me, or I'd travel and, bring like a whole suitcase home, and started like really rapidly consuming all the little bit of information that was out there at the time, and started homebrewing them, and was kind of like became known as like the Haze Bro in the Portland homebrewing scene, and was like winning best of show and like NHC first round golds and stuff with my hazy IPAs. I remember the first time I won a best of show with a hazy IPA at the big kind of end of year Oregon competition. I was told that in the best of show table, people were like, "What the heck is this?" And someone goes, "Oh, this is one of those newfangled hazy IPAs." And everyone's like, "Oh, I've heard of those." And I honestly think I won just because people were excited to try a hazy IPA for their first time.
Yeah, dude, I hear that. So we're coming up on a break here, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But taking everything that we just talked about, what are your opinions on the current state right now, today, where we're standing, in 2024? What are your opinions on where IPA is, and just the general fact that we have a bazillion different versions of it?
That's an interesting question. I think that that's pretty much the gist of it. Is there's a bazillion versions.
Yeah.
I think that some of the more old school stuff, like, we're not making IPAs with bouillon or oak aging them and sending them across the sea. I think a few of those things have fallen to the wayside. Maybe not typically as malty, but generally speaking, I think all bets are off, and there are just a bazillion different ways to skin the cat at this point.
Yeah, so you and I are in the same boat on that. I think we share that opinion. My thing, from a pragmatic perspective, I just wish we would move away from using the letters IP and A to describe hoppy beer, because that specific terminology, India Pale Ale and then IPA, was, from my experience at least, was used to describe a very specific set of characteristics you would expect from a beer. Now we just tag it onto anything that has a bunch of hops in it, and I feel like we could come up with way more descriptive names for these styles, and I might be alone in that. Maybe there are people out there who share that opinion, but when you've got, as we're going to go over in the next segment, when you've got so many different versions of the same thing, it starts to me to dilute the meaning of that thing. And so my only issue, I love the fact that there's all these versions, don't get me wrong. Whatever floats your boat, the fact that there's an IPA option for every drinker, whatever, is great. Using that term, it feels almost like a marketing gimmick that, it says IPA, that people are going to buy it if we put IPA on it. So that is my opinion. Do you agree or disagree with that, Jordan?
Well, I think that with this many different nuances, that it helps to have a common lexicon. And so I think for better or for worse, we're stuck with the letters IPA. But as we can have a friendly debate in the next section, I think there are meaningful differences across the various, shades of IPA. And I think that it's helpful to have some sort of common language to differentiate them.
Amen to that. Well, we do have to get to a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be sharing our opinions on the 1,469 variations of IPA. Stick around. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Are you ready for your brewing game to upgrade? Well, the Easy Dens and Smart Ref combo by Anton Parr delivers just that. Get precise wort and alcohol content measurements and follow the fermentation of your beer straight on your phone. The Brewmeister app helps you analyze data, compare batches, and perfect your recipes. We're big fans of the Easy Dens and use it to get accurate measurements with very reliable results. Just ask the Brewlosophy Show's Martin Keene. Check out EasyDens.com today and use code BREW15 for 15% off. That's BRU15 to get 15% off your order.
Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Now is the time to make a plan. Whether you plan to vote absentee by mail, in person at your county auditor's office before Election Day, or at your polling place on November 5th, it's important you take steps now to make your plan at voterready.iowa.gov. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Find more info at voterready.iowa.gov. This message is presented by the Iowa Secretary of State.
The mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank. And like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
It is not my point to sound like a curmudgeonly old man, but it is absolutely true that I remember the days when IPA was a single style. And while versions from different breweries had their own unique qualities, they all more or less shared a set of characteristics, as I discussed in the last section. These days, if I see an IPA on a beer menu, I feel like I have to dig a little deeper to make sure it's a version that I actually enjoy, because there are some I simply do not. Well, Jordan, I know you share this sentiment on some level, but I'm certain our preferences don't perfectly align. For this segment, we're going to go over all of the various types of IPA that we're aware of, at least at this moment, that brewers have invented over the last couple of decades, and share our honest opinions about each of them. Where would you like to start, Jordan?
Well, I think we got to start with classic American IPA, which is a bit of a esoteric, hard to find item at this point.
Yes, it is.
Right. So what do you think is a still available quintessential classic American IPA?
So we are in a weird time with craft beer and brewing right now. So it's a lot more difficult to find stuff that just 6 years ago was constantly on the store shelves. But to me, what I would say is a classic, has all of the qualities, at least, of that classic American IPA from 20 years ago would be something like Sierra Nevada Torpedo. It's got a nice malt backbone. To me, it just tastes like an amplified version of Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And it has that malt backbone with a nice assertive bitterness and some good, Cascade Chinook hop character to it, but it's not fruit juice. The same goes for something like Red Hook Longhammer. I don't know. Can you think of any other ones?
Up here, everything is like, they don't even sell crystal malt anymore. It's just like Pilsner malt or bust. So it's, I'm really scratching my head to think of any kind of classic ones. Maybe Pliny the Elder is more in line with that. Granted, it's quote double, but I'm struggling to think of too many modern examples.
So as far as your thoughts on that, it's not really a style. And we know that we're going to get shit for this from some people. But when we're thinking of that classic American IPA, under which everything else we're going to talk about falls, what are your thoughts on that as a style, or just, perceptually speaking, what do you like it or not? Or
yeah, so I think that to level set, I think that we can still brew classic American IPA at the homebrew level for sure.
Yeah.
And you're looking at C hops, and you're using a little bit of crystal malt, and you're using a Chico strain, and you're fairly bitter, and probably not the crazy levels of dry hopping or wool pulling that we'd use in more modern examples. I think it's really fun when someone brings one to a homebrew club meeting and having a sample. But I don't really need more than 4 ounces of it or so. There's just not enough, modern hop expression. You wouldn't want to use New Zealand hops in a classic American IPA. You would want to use crystal malt. These are kind of just not really what I'm looking for in 2024.
Yeah, and my thing is that when I drink a IPA, I don't even care if it's a modern crisp, made with Pilsner malt IPA. It is, it's a different experience than drinking something like a cream ale or a Pilsner. I can only have so many of them. They're more filling. That is even more so for these more classic, crystal malt laden IPA, where if I drink a Torpedo, for example, that might be the only IPA I have for the night because it's just so rich, and I have this weird, this is maybe, too much information or TMI, but I get a weird thing when I have really rich beer that I get these acid spots on my tongue that are really painful. And that has been something that I've consistently experienced when I have high crystal malt or seemingly, more malty, I'll say, versions of hoppy beer like Torpedo or Longhammer, stuff like that. So I'm not saying that I don't like them. If somebody gives me a can of Torpedo, you better believe I'm drinking it and I'm going to enjoy it as well. But it's not something I'm going to reach for on the regular.
And the big thing is those have to be fresh because, as we've learned, crystal malt just has a really quick staling power. And so if it's fresh, it's great. If it's old, it's horrible.
Yeah. So let's go with some of the offshoots now, because that's gonna be our baseline, is that classic American IPA that we're all somewhat familiar with, though don't really have much access to these days unless we're brewing it ourselves. What is, to your mind, kind of the first real evolution away from that, yet still under the umbrella of IPA?
Yeah, I think that West Coast IPA, we talked about the forefathers of it in the last segment with the Lagunitas and the Russian Rivers of the world, but we've just become even crisper and leaner and more tropical hop expression. So a modern West Coast IPA is going to have 0 crystal malt, often using Pilsner malt. Pale malt is fine too. And we're now starting to get friendly with the Down Under and looking at Australian and New Zealand hops.
Yep.
And also shifting away from the danker varieties of, Yakima, more in favor of more modern fruity varieties like Mosaic and Citra, and just is huge, heavy whirlpool and dry hop additions to make it honestly like more Pilsner-like drinkability in terms of the body.
Yeah.
And so a lower finishing gravity than we would have seen in American classic style. And then without the crystal malt to make it more drinkable, but with that reasonable bitter backbone. So in some ways it's like kind of an American German Pils to a certain extent, where we're just, there is some drinkability in dry Pilsner malt beer that's bitter.
Yeah, it's going to, I get what you're saying about being somewhat analogous to like a German Pils. I would almost compare it more to like a Dortmunder Export, given its higher strength. But these aren't going to, you can have a couple of these and still be able to walk straight, But to me, West Coast IPA, when I first recall hearing that term being used for it, it really meant, and again, this was like 2010s, late 2009, 2008, 2009 to like 2012-ish. There was a lot of talk around moving those hop additions from, early in the kettle to later in the kettle. And then obviously dry hopping with more and more and more. And that produced, when we started brewing those types of beers, and the brewing network, I feel like really put West Coast IPA, at least that terminology, on the map. What we were getting, it started with moving your hop additions. You still had a little bit of crystal malt. You still had, some more malt character in those beers. And then as we've realized, boy, when we move all those hops down, the sweetness, we don't need to balance the sweetness as much, right? So we don't need as much. We're not making these beers as bitter. Now they're tasting too sweet. What if we take out all the crystal malt? Ooh, now we've got this fresh palate, right? That we can throw even more hops at. And that was the evolution as I witnessed it, at least from my perspective. And it turned into what we call West Coast IPA today, which are these super pale, highly hopped, moderately, but not terribly assertively bittered. What are your thoughts on the bitterness of this style?
Yeah, so I think that a really common approach is to have a solid 60-minute addition, but maybe in like the 20 to 30 IBUs.
Yes.
That you were achieving from that 60-minute addition, and then the remaining 40, IBUs or so are coming from basically whirlpool additions. As we know, you can measure those in terms of their IBU, but their perceived bitterness is way different, and you're preserving a lot of those, fruity, citrusy, tropical, volatile flavors and aromas that you just can't get if you boil them for 60 minutes.
Yeah.
And so although we might still be fairly bitter in terms of our ability to, measure it, it's a way different drinking experience. And in my opinion, it's way more pleasurable. And it has the added benefit of all those fruity, flavors and aromas that you get, that you would otherwise drive off in a boil.
Yeah. So in terms of your preference, opinion-wise, on West Coast IPA, am I to assume that it's fairly high?
I would say it's one of the best styles ever invented.
I'm with you on that. That I in terms of hoppy beers. Now, obviously, I would drink, German lager over West Coast IPA most days of the week. That's just my preference. But I feel like West Coast IPA took American IPA, what we knew of it in the 90s, and made it substantially better, in my opinion. Now, when we move into the next sub-style, Midwest IPA, things are going to look a little bit different. When you think, you're not going to find Midwest IPA in the BJCP guidelines, at least I haven't. When you think of this, though, this idea of Midwest IPA, which I feel like a lot of brewers are fairly they're pretty familiar with this idea of a Midwest IPA. I've heard people call it East Coast IPA as well. What does your thoughts go to?
Maltier, darker, and higher finishing gravity. And probably more of a reliance on classic C hops as opposed to modern like New Zealand, Australian varieties. In some ways, it's kind of a throwback to the classic American IPA and just really preserving some of that heritage.
You took the thoughts out of my head, except what I would say is that the Midwest brewers who were, I guess promulgating this style really leaned into malty. So the way I view a Midwest IPA is they kind of followed the trend of adding more and more and more hops, but to balance that, they went with more malty or grains that are going to contribute a higher malt character. Obviously, that's going to include sea malts, but also if you look at some Midwest IPA recipes on Brewfather, you're going to find things like a big chunk of Munich malt, maybe a small whisper of some chocolate malt to increase the perception of maltiness in that beer. It is a very unique style that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I've had some pretty decent examples of. You mentioned it before as well with things like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which I would say pales, no pun intended, pales in comparison in terms of the maltiness to these real Midwest IPAs, that they do not age very well because of that malt character. And as you know, over time, as that hop pungency decreases, that maltiness just becomes way too strong for my palate.
Yeah. Part of me thinks they're kind of a mess. And I don't think they're nearly as sessionable as a drier West Coast style. It's like a really good example is enjoyable, but really 1 pint is all I need, and I'm ready to move on to a different style. And it's just kind of a gamble when buying them, because if it's not fresh, it's not going to be that great.
No, and I'll tell you what, next time you and I are together and we go to a bar, the only bar in probably the United States that actually has what they refer to as a Midwest IPA on tap, I'll split a pint with you because I'm not sure I could finish the whole thing myself. They're just too rich. But you talk to contributor Steve Thanos, who lives in Chicago, the Midwest. He is a huge fan of them. And in fact, I love the fact that he will brew these more Midwest style IPAs for a lot of his experiments because he enjoys them that much. And that's the beauty of preference, is it is very subjective. Now, we've spent some time already talking about hazy IPA. We're not going to belabor this, but I will say that when hazy IPA became a thing, I was shocked with the controversy, or I should say the critical opinions that so many people had about it. And somehow, some way, maybe because we have this voice through the podcast and the website and stuff, I became associated with haters of hazy IPA. I don't know how many times I've said this, but I'm going to say it again now. I don't hate the style. I'm not upset that people spun off of West Coast IPA to create this hazy version of a non-bitter, soft mouthfeel beer. I think it's wonderful that people enjoy it. Am I a huge fan of it? No. I'm going to drink a few cans of it today because my friend brought some over. Like, I'm not going to complain about it. But it's almost like this, the people who loved to hate this new style, there was that section. And then there were people who loved to point the finger at people loving to hate the style erroneously. Like, I don't hate it. So that's what I have to say. That's my opinion on hazy IPA.
Well, I've really come full circle because I was like a crazy hazy evangelist, and I'm now reformed, and I despise it. I don't hate it from a philosophical perspective. They just don't please me.
Yeah.
You know, like even when I get a really good example of the style, like Monkish in LA, you're like, dude, this is incredible. Thank you for the taster. I will now have a pint of your West Coast IPA, please. When bad ones are horrible.
Yeah.
Mediocre ones are not good. In really good examples, a taster is all I need. Just something about the mouthfeel and everything, even in the most well-executed styles, it just doesn't do it for me anymore, which is so weird because I was obsessed with it 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I will say, this is not to pat my own back. I don't fancy myself a world-class brewer by any means, but the best hazy IPA I've ever had was one that I made. And I think the reason for that isn't because of my brewing prowess. It's because it was as fresh as possible. I mean, I was drinking it like 6 days after I made it. And what I hate about hazy IPA is just how quickly they deteriorate. For whatever reason, I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers. Their shelf life is so much lower than other styles of beer, and that makes it a struggle for me because if I'm going to the store, I have a friend who, Craig, he does the brews reviews or the average brew reviews with us. He loves hazy IPA. He's really become a lover of it. And so if he's coming over, I'll go grab a 6-pack of Mind Haze or something like that, locally, local stuff that I can get my hands on. That's how I have some in my fridge, as he brought some over last weekend. Every time I drink one, it's like, God, it's a week later. Is it going to be as good as it was last week? And usually it's not. And that's a bummer to me. So, that's my big hang up with hazy IPA is just how incredibly sensitive they are to time and oxygen and all of that stuff. But a fresh example, if I go to Crow and Wolf and they just kegged a version of their hazy IPA, I'll have a sample of it before I move on to something else, just like you. I'm not going to hate on it. And I love the fact that I do feel like it introduced hoppy beer to a much wider swath of people who were not interested in bitterness per se.
And it's also kind of funny how haze crazed people these days tend to not be brewers.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And this is a brewer town, and the brewers are, big patrons of the breweries that, thrive here. And the, like Great Notion is a haze focused brewery in Portland, Oregon, which actually has outposts throughout the country now. And brewers, wouldn't be caught dead there. And it's like the brewers at, other breweries that don't just specialize in hazy IPA, they know they have to make it because that's what the masses want, but they refuse to drink it. And it's so funny how like brewers are a victim of their own success on this style, and they brew this style that they loathe because they, what I think was it Mike Tonsmeyer that said something like, people that don't make hazy IPAs are for people that don't like money.
You've got to make what people are going to pay for. I'm so glad that for the most part, it seems these craft brewers have moved away from what I would argue the sanctimonious opinion that I'm going to brew what I like to drink and it'll sell. Well, no, that didn't work for you. You got to brew what the customer wants to pay for. That's how a business works. So, all right, let's move into the red and yellow, black and white version of the IPA. I remember sometime in the last 15 years or so, this move to make every color of beer an IPA. For me, that started with Celebration Ale. I always viewed it as a red IPA. And, to me, it's a style that if we're going to kind of isolate red IPA as being its own sub-style, to me, it really is you can make really good versions of red IPA. I think you have to pick the right hops, and you have to go with a bit more bitterness than we're used to in modern, West Coast style IPA and stuff, because you have to balance the sweetness that from whatever grains are contributing that red color to the beer. But my opinion on red IPA, I'd give it like an 8 out of 10. I actually quite enjoy, of all the colored IPAs that are out there, red IPA is probably my favorite.
Yeah, I'd probably say it's maybe my second favorite behind the white IPA, which you never see. But that was kind of fun, right? Where it was like kind of like a hoppy wit beer. But I think maybe that's just because I like lighter beers. I think in general, when it comes to hoppy beers, the malt character is just not what I'm looking for. That being said, a really well-crafted red IPA would probably be my favorite darker IPA, maybe even more so than like a Midwest IPA. Then again, this is when we kind of get into like style differentiation.
Yeah.
Is a Midwest IPA a red IPA? Sometimes.
Yeah. You and I are on the same level. I was going to comment on that as well, that there are IPAs out there that are just standard, what I would refer to as a classic American, maybe even Midwest IPA, that would fall under this loose description of what we refer to as a red IPA. To me, a defining characteristic of red IPA, though, is that it's not sweet. It's got more malt character because obviously it requires malt to get red, but it is not, it doesn't have that like sticky feeling in your mouth. At least I don't experience it that way. It's still dry. It's still crushable. And usually it's clear. By the way, if you've ever seen a hazy version of a colored IPA, they look awful. They usually look like diarrhea, if you ask me. That to me is just unappealing to the eyes, and I'm right off the bat, I'm biased against it. So in my opinion, let's leave hazy IPA as being its own sub-style like that, and all these colored ones probably should be at least marginally clear.
Right. Yeah. And, another thing about red IPA is you're using classic C hops.
Yeah.
And really it was a popular style in the Pacific Northwest in the, early 2000s and the aughts, really kind of a brew pub style of beer. Really nice, but not something I need more than a pint of, but a fun, nostalgic throwback for sure.
Yeah, and since you commented on white IPA, I'm going to share my opinion on it. I've never had one that I even remotely enjoyed, and I like wit beer. I don't love it. Like I've probably made like 6 or 7 in my day, but it's a classic style Belgian style that I'm really fond of the history behind it, and I like drinking the occasional one. Every white IPA I've ever had, I felt was just so clashing and so gross that I don't even think I was able to finish a full bottle of it.
Well, I don't know that That would be interesting to know how many are currently in production, because my guess would be, of all the breweries that are currently operating in the U.S., I wouldn't be surprised if there's fewer than 12 being made like in October of 2024. This style is just completely dead. And the only one I can even remember was I think it was called Chainbreaker by New Belgium.
Yep, that was the first one I ever had, actually. And sorry, New Belgium. Big fan of your other beers, some of your other beers, but that Chainbreaker was awful to me. I had a buddy who made a white IPA. 'Cause, there's trends in brewing, and everybody does the same thing at the same time. And a local buddy of mine made a white IPA. He thought it was great. I thought it was awful. But that's just personal preference. It wasn't like the beer was bad. My palate just clashed. That kind of fruity, spicy, peppery thing that you get from a wheat beer yeast. With the hops, it just did not work for me. I feel like the natural spin-off of that to talk about next would be Belgian IPA, because Belgian yeast has a lot of the similar characteristics as wheat beer yeast. It's going to be far more fermentation forward. You're going to get that spicy phenol and fruity estery thing, but along with hops. Before I share my opinion on this, what is yours? Did you like Belgian IPA as much as you did white IPA?
I guess similar kind of level of indifference. Wasn't by any means obsessed, but thought that I appreciated the paler nature of them. But yeah, talk about an esoteric defunct style. Like, you just don't see that anymore.
No, I remember. So again, I have local friends. Whenever there was a trend happening, we'd all brew it, or some of us would take to brewing it. But Stone released their Cali Belgique, and I had a bottle of it. It was a real fancy looking bottle, real pretty, but it was their like California version of a Belgian ale, which meant basically Belgian IPA. And shared a bomber of it with some friends of mine. I hated it. And then my wife and I ended up down in Escondido. This was probably back in 2010 or 11. And I could be off on that. But I went, she had to go take care of something. So she dropped me off at Stone, and I went and just sat at the bar and ordered samples. They had so many beers on tap that I just ordered samples. And one of them, I thought, let me try Cali Belgique here. It's probably way better than out of the bottle. It was so awful to me. I just thought it tasted so fucking gross. Again, part of it has to do, I believe, with my expectation of hoppy does not have fermentation character with it. And so it's like the gears are grinding on my palate, and it's just not working. And I don't feel compelled to force myself to like it,
Well, that's pretty funny, because the New Zealand Saison that I shared with you is arguably a Belgian IPA, and you enjoyed it quite much.
I loved it. And that was one of the things I was hoping you would bring up, was that I feel like there are characteristics in a lot of the modern hops that are coming out today. And these are they're being selected for, the breeders are doing this very intentionally, but particularly these New World hops, New Zealand and Australia hops that can have this melding effect with fermentation character that actually amplifies desirable aspects. My thing was, I don't know what hops were used in Cali Belgique, but my hunch is it was probably the popular varieties of the time. Simcoe, maybe some Mosaic, but probably Chinook and Cascade, because we know Stone used a lot of that stuff. To me, that's not what worked, right? I wasn't a fan of it back then. I would have to imagine that a well-made IPA fermented with Belgian yeast these days would probably be a different story for me.
I totally agree. It was a clunky style. It was bitter. It had crystal malt in it, C hops. I think we can do it better, but we just that is another style that's like no one would call it a Belgian IPA anymore. It'd be rare to find anything like that. Instead, it'd be more like, hoppy Saison or something like that.
Right.
But if you want to talk clunky styles, in my opinion, the king is the black IPA or the CDA, Cascadian Dark Ale. Roast and hops, I don't get it. I just have never had one that I liked. Back when I started brewing, I made a handful of them because it was kind of an emerging style at the time, and it was Portland proud about our home style here.
Yeah.
And I was like, why am I brewing this? I don't like it. And I did all the things, the cold steeping of the malts overnight, and then you add it to your mash and capping, etc. And I mean, in my opinion, just take some Cinnamar and color your IPA black. The pronounced roast character just is a total clash, in my opinion, for a hoppy beer.
Yeah, so that is more or less the same opinion that I have, and I feel like that's the same opinion a lot of the people that we're friendly with from other podcasts and stuff share. There's one exception to that. Firestone Walker, they have Wookie Jack, which is a rye black IPA or a black rye IPA. And I have never had that beer and not thoroughly loved it. It is so delicious. And I just saw, I don't know if they've already released it, but it looks like they might be releasing it for a limited time coming up here soon. And I will definitely be buying some. Have you ever had Wookie Jack?
I probably have, but I don't remember like enough about it. I remember the name for sure. And I would love to try a sample or a can or a draft pour because, you know, I'm a very open-minded person when it comes to beer and never say never, but it definitely the some of my experiences with the style have left me not going back for another pint.
Yeah, so that is the only black. I've made multiple black IPA. In fact, when I was brewing with my friend Chris, 10 years ago, he took a liking to this black IPA or CDA style, and so we would occasionally brew 5-gallon batches of it, and he ended up drinking far more of it than I did because he was a bigger fan. Like you, the dark roasted malt character with the hops just kind of clash. So not a big fan, but my opinion is vastly different when it comes to the brown IPA style. I think most notably Janet's Brown Ale was kind of what put this quote unquote sub style, on the map. And I had the great fortune of being able to taste, I think it was the first Pro-Am batch that Tasty made with Vinny at Russian River back in 2010 or 11. I'm telling you right now, that was one of the few experiences that I've had with a new style new to me style, where I was like, whoa, what have I been missing? This is phenomenal.
Yeah, that is one style that I've had so few examples. I can't remember ever trying it. Probably would have tried a Janet's Brown, either pro or homebrew, after Tasty passed, because there was like a lot of breweries were making it in celebration of in memory of his life.
Yeah.
But you do not see that style around anymore.
No, you really don't. And it's unfortunate because I feel like that is, it's kind of like red IPA, where you look at classic American IPA and then if you put together all of the stuff that we've found really seems to contribute to, beers that are good, and you remove some of the stuff that may have contributed to beers that we don't like so much, that's kind of where brown and red IPA fall in my mind. Is they've learned how to keep these beers malty yet dry and not sickly sweet, but with really nice hop character that melds well with this kind of malt backbone. Big fan of brown IPA when it's done right.
So I think that collectively what I'm realizing here is I just don't love a ton of malt character in a hop forward beer. I like malty styles. I love big barley wines, etc. But when it comes to a hoppy IPA, get the malt out of the way. And I think that that's really just kind of the larger preference that I have. It doesn't mean that I despise red IPA or Midwest IPA. It's just like not exactly what I'm looking for. And so I think now what's left are these super bone dry, no malt whatsoever styles that we haven't talked about. And it's actually not on our list here, but we would be remiss if we didn't mention the short-lived Brute IPA.
Oh yeah. What were your thoughts on that style?
Well, it was about 1 month long. But Freem made one that was to die for. It was so crushable and so light and spritzy, and it preceded all of this modern stuff like cold IPA, West Coast Pils, etc., which we'll talk about in a second. And it was just a really, if anything, a bit of a forefather for the modern West Coast IPA that we have today, which is really lean without the malt character and dry. Those Brute IPAs, they were driving them down to as close to zero Plato as possible. They would back off the bitterness, maybe 20 IBUs or something was the IBU goal, because at that dry level, they thought that there was a perceived enhancement of any sort of remnant bitterness character. So what was the kitchen in Oakland called again? The guy that made it, that invented it? What was it called?
Social Kitchen?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of drinking his beers from him at his brewery when he was still open. And like I said, Freem made this great example. I absolutely loved it. And I think that it really set the stage for what these kind of drier, lighter versions of IPA could be.
Yeah, I'm not trying to butter your buns here, Jordan, but the absolute best brewed IPA I ever had was the one you sent to me well before you were ever a contributor to Brewlosophy. You sent me 2 bottles. I shared one with a friend, and then I bogarted the other one and drank it by myself because it was so good. I liked the style. I felt like it was a little too much overthought. We'll put it that way. I feel like it was a little overthought, having to use enzymes. I think I made a batch or 2 using enzymes of brewed IPA. They came out fine. But it was just something, the commercial examples that I had from bigger breweries like Sierra Nevada put one out, wasn't a big fan of those. The home brewed ones were always much better to me than those, but a fun style. I do feel like that was kind of the precursor to the 3 styles we're going to kind of clump together here, and we can talk about the differences. But cold IPA, India Pale Lager, IPL, and West Coast Pils. What I was told when I was talking to a professional brewer friend of mine is the difference between the 3 of these. Well, really cold IPA and IPL was that cold IPA is basically your classic West Coast IPA that's fermented with a lager yeast, but at warmer temperatures. So like 60 to 65 F, you're looking at 15 to 18 C, whereas India Pale Lager is basically an IPA, but made with all Pilsner malt. So like a classic West Coast, but fermented cold and then dry hopped really heavily. Is that kind of maybe somebody just made that up or?
Well, I think that before cold IPA existed, back in the classic American IPA world, IPL was basically taking a classic American IPA and fermenting it cold with lager yeast. So that meant it did have crystal malt and stuff back in the day, and C hops and things like that. And I think that it was just kind of another clunky style. That cold fermentation with the sulfur production, et cetera, didn't do it any favors. And so I think the cold IPA is kind of taking lessons learned along the way and let's dry that out. Let's get rid of the crystal malt. Heck, let's add in 30% adjunct like rice or corn to really dry it out.
Yeah.
And we don't want all that sulfur from a cold fermentation. So what we've learned is that this 3470 works quite well at slightly warmer temperatures. And why not just do that? And so I think that cold IPA really resolves some of the problems that were inherent with the IPL.
I couldn't agree more. And all of the IPL I had, could take it or leave it. They were fine. I love cold IPA. The Crow and Wolf makes an absolutely phenomenal cold IPA they call Frostbite. Holy cow, it's delicious. And it's made with New World hops as well. So you get a lot of that real pungent hoppiness. But the last style we're going to focus on, we are running out of time here, is kind of what I would consider kind of a spin-off of that style. It's not technically an IPA, but I feel like it deserves some mention because of the fact that it is a highly hoppy Pilsner-esque style called West Coast Pils, which I've never brewed, but I've had a few examples of it at your place, actually, Jordan. But tell us a little bit about West Coast Pils and your opinions on that.
Yeah, so we're basically taking a Pilsner beer type grist, so 1048 OG or so, maybe just 100% Pilsner malt, and then we're hopping it basically like an American IPA. We're probably going to reduce the bitterness a smidge, so maybe 60, 50 IBUs or so instead of 70 or something. But generally speaking, we have these heavy whirlpool additions and these heavy dry hop additions, but we're fermenting fairly cold with lager yeast, maybe 50F or something like that. We don't want to go too low to create too much sulfur, but we are trying to get that cold fermentation. We're dry hopping pre-lagering, then we're lagering for 2 or 3 weeks to get it, probably fining it to get it clear. And it's really, in my opinion, the best of both worlds. You get the intense hop pungency of an IPA, but with the sessionability of a lager. So at 4.5, 5.2% alcohol or so, you can actually throw a couple back and still walk a straight line.
Yeah, I will say as my final opinion on these various substyles that I hope West Coast Pils continues to stay a thing and doesn't go the way of the black IPA or the other Belgian IPA, because it really is a delicious style. Some would argue that it's not really a style; it's just a hoppy Pils. Whatever, call it what you want. The idea of bumping up the hop character in a really nice, crisp, clean, refreshing, crushable Pilsner, I love it, and the ones that I've had have been excellent. So, real briefly, our views on the future of IPA. it's hard for me, given how many versions of IPA currently exist, to envision there being more, but I can only imagine what brewers are going to come up with next. And while I'm probably not going to love everything that they do invent, I think it's going to be fun to try it out and to see the creativity that brewers, we are a notoriously creative bunch. I get that. But to see what people come up with, it's going to be fun to try those, whether I like them or not.
I think that we're going to see more blending of the lines here. For example, there's a bit of a movement to brew your West Coast IPAs with lager yeast. Well, it's like, then what is a West Coast Pils? What is a cold IPA at this point if we're using lager yeast in all of these? And then we have things like Cellar Maker's West Coast Hazies.
Yeah.
And so I think that the lines are going to continue to get blurred, but we're going to have a lot of fun along the way.
Amen to that. Well, that is all the time we've got for this one. Don't forget to listen and subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing professionals to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And make sure to head to brewlosophy.com to stay current on all of the fun beer and brewing stuff we are up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Now is the time to make a plan. Whether you plan to vote absentee by mail, in person at your county auditor's office before Election Day, or at your polling place on November 5th, it's important you take steps now to make your plan at voterready.iowa.gov. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Find more info at voterready.iowa.gov. This message is presented by the Iowa Secretary of State.